My clock shows about 3:16, so we'll get rolling. I know it's kind of the end of the day. We are here to talk about Azure Data disaster recovery strategies. You're going to see a bunch of obligatory slides. If you got cell phones, go ahead and put them on silent for me. If you get a phone call, we know production DBAs, you got work, family life to deal with. Just go ahead and take a step outside. If it continues to ring, I get to answer it, and we'll have some fun with that. Okay. Make sure while you're here, explore everything that PaaS has to offer. If you are in a location that's got a user group, please get invested and involved with your local user group. Who's been to a SQL Saturday? Good number of you, okay? SQL Saturdays are a great way to get free training. Speakers come on site for a day of training, totally free for you, usually as attendees, except for you might have to pay for lunch. Virtual chapters, PaaS actually has a very large amount of virtual chapters that you can attend meetings, get free training while you sit at your desk at lunch. Most of them meet once a month. There's virtual groups on HADR, PowerShell, Spanish, Russian, German. There's a whole slew of virtual groups out there to get free training. Session evals. I love session evals. You can tell me I'm good, you can tell me I'm bad. I don't care if you tell me that I suck, just tell me why. I'm a big boy, you're not going to offend me. If you tell me that I sucked, but don't tell me why, then I might come talk to you. Okay? So we like feedback. Not only me, but the other sessions that you attend, please give the speakers feedback. We do take that feedback and make adjustments to our presentations to make them better. Okay? So please do that. My name's John Morehouse. I'm a consultant with Denny Cherry & Associates. We're a small boutique of SQL Server consultants. My contact information is on that slide. You can contact me about, the only thing I just noticed, my email is not there. My email is john@dcac.com. You can contact me on any question about the presentation today, or if you are stuck at something with work, drop me a note. If I know the answer, I'll give it to you. If I don't know the answer, I can at least try to point you in the right direction. Working for Denny Cherry & Associates, we're very community focused, so we like to help out when we can. Who's on Twitter? Good number of you. If you're not on Twitter, I highly recommend you get on Twitter, if not for anything else but the SQL Help hashtag. A lot of the speakers here today are on the SQL Help hashtag. They'll also help answer your question for completely free. I have solved production, real-world, enterprise-wide problems using Twitter. It is really cool to go to your boss, who at the time was the chief security officer and absolutely refused to allow me to use Twitter on my work laptop. Guest network is really cool. And I solved that problem, and I said, hey, boss, I just saved the company money because I solved our problem that we were having using Twitter. Because you got people like Brent Ozar, Paul Randall, really smart people that work at Microsoft, write the product, Bob Ward. They're answering questions on Twitter for free. So make sure you get on Twitter. And I am SQL R Us. That's not SQL Russ. SQL R Us. Toys R Us, everything toys. I touch about everything in SQL. I speak a lot. I blog, I tweet. I'm an MVP data platform. I'm also known as DBA with a bat. I actually have an 18-inch Louisville Slugger bat that I used to carry around the office. Developers really liked me when I came to the meetings with my bat. I live in Louisville, Kentucky, and that's where the Louisville bats come from. I'm involved in my local chapter, user group admin, and I organize SQL Saturdays. I've organized 8, 9, 10 SQL Saturdays before. So, quick shameless plug about Denny Cherry & Associates. We are a small boutique of 8 individuals spread out across the United States. We do really cool things with SQL Server. If you're stuck on something, feel free to drop us a note. I got business cards and laptop stickers up in the front of the podium in the corner. So, let's start talking about where we are going to go today. So we're going to talk about some terminology. I still run into clients that want to go to the cloud. Let me back up. How many DBAs do I have? Oh, good number of you. Okay, DBAs, what about developers? Okay, so 4, 5, 6, most of us are DBAs. Okay, cool. How many of us work in an organization where your management says, we're going to go to the cloud, and then they leave it at that, and they know nothing about the cloud? Okay, so a few of you have raised your hands. Okay, terminology is really important, especially when you start talking about DR scenarios with the cloud technology, just as important on your on-premises stuff. I'll also caveat, there is always an ongoing verbal battle, whether it's on-premise, on-prem, on-premises. I don't care. If we're talking about on-prem stuff and whatever terminology you use, I get. You might see me switch or hear me switch in between as we go. but I don't care what you say or what you use, I can follow along, okay? We're gonna talk about terminology. We're gonna talk about what you get out of the box today. If you just stood up an Azure resource, let's say a SQL DB, what kind of disaster recovery capabilities it comes with straight out of the box, okay? We're gonna talk backups. Yes, we can actually take backups on certain resources in the cloud. We're gonna talk about availability groups. Who's using availability groups on-prem today? So about 20% of you. Everybody else, what are you using? Got any high availability? What are you using? Okay. Failover cluster, okay. Log ship, who said log shipping? Anybody else using log shipping for stuff? Log shipping is the most robust thing ever. It is somewhat old, but log shipping does wonders for many, many different problems, okay? Anyways, we're also gonna talk about failover groups and geo-replication and what those mean and how to set them up. I've got about 4 demos for you that we'll kind of go through. Hopefully the demo gods are polite with me. If not, I actually have them previously recorded that I can play. And we'll do questions and answers. Who's in the cloud today? So about half of you. Okay, Azure, AWS, everybody Azure? Okay, most of Azure, okay. I assume the rest of you are planning to go to the cloud or at least thinking about going to the cloud. So I still have to have this conversation when I talk to clients about moving to the cloud. Moving to the cloud, and I still talk to C-level people that think the cloud, you put your data in the cloud and it just goes off into the ether. It's limbo. And somehow gets magically reconstituted back down when they go to the web page or do whatever they need to do, that data bits just come right back on down. It really is no cloud, it's somebody else's computer. I don't care whether you're talking about Microsoft, AWS, Google, Rackspace, private cloud, the DC down the road that pays you a lot or charges you a lot of money to say they have a private cloud. It's somebody else's computer, somebody else's hardware. Okay, so when you start to have these conversations about beginning to move to the cloud, we also have to keep this in mind when we talk about DR in the cloud. It's somebody else's computer. And unfortunately, we have this thing that we like to affectionately call the Backhoe Phenomenon. Who here has worked, you're in the office and suddenly you lose all power, all internet, all everything because the Spectrum cable guy next door for the business next door was out there with a backhoe, a jackhammer, something, and guess what he did? He cut the wrong cord or cable or conduit, okay? This happens in the cloud. We've had data centers go down because somebody cut the wrong cord. That's why we need to think about disaster recovery when we go to the cloud. The cloud isn't going to solve all your problems. So let's talk about terminology. So when we deal with the cloud, and especially with disaster recovery, we have to think about geographies, regions, and zones. So the cloud is really broken up into geolocated boundaries. Within those geographies, we have what are called regions, okay? Within those regions, if it's zone capable, you have 3 different zones per region, okay? We're gonna talk about pause. We're also gonna talk about high availability does not equal disaster recovery. This is also very important, okay? We're gonna talk about some objectives, and we're gonna talk about what these gobbledygook of letters mean, okay? So I mentioned already that geographies is divided into, the world is divided into geographies. They're geopolitical, okay? It's also very important when you put resources in the cloud, Microsoft, at least from Azure, Microsoft will not move your data outside that region. So if you put data in the United States, it won't move your data outside of the United States, okay? And a region, excuse me, a region is defined by the bandwidth and latency between. Usually regions are hundreds of miles apart, okay? It's also very important to remember that when you talk about regions, your data can sit in multiple data centers within a region. You don't know which data center your data is sitting. Microsoft has actually taken very big steps. The people that work in the data centers can't see whose data they are serving while they go to work. The people outside of the data centers can't figure out where your data goes, usually. There are some tricks that you can do. I'm not going to tell you those tricks. but they've done very extensive things to make sure that the data is protected, okay? So the regions are 100 miles apart, and that gives us methods to make sure our data can be recovered across, let's say, hurricanes on the East Coast. Who here lives on the East Coast besides you? Hurricanes are great, okay? Not really. I don't know why you live on the East Coast, but they consider Kentucky the East Coast. Zones are within the regions. There are 3 zones if the region is zone enabled, okay? The zones also is more aligned probably with high availability, but out of the box, we do get some utilization from a DR perspective with the zones. We can do certain things within the zones, and this helps us to provide DR for our data. There's regions all over the United States, okay? So if you're not, anybody here not from the United States? A couple? Oh yeah, I should have known, Rob. Sorry. Microsoft is also investing a lot of money. Who here thinks, or who works for an organization where they think the cloud is a fad? It's going to go away. We still have conversations with people that tell us that the cloud is a fad. It's going to go away. I assure you people, it's not going to go away. I don't care whether it's Microsoft or Google or AWS. It's not going to go away. It's here to stay. These regions obviously are all over the United States, all over the world, so you can put data wherever you'd like. That being said, what's one of the big things that came out of the UK about May of last year? GDPR. If I had swag, I'd give you. I got stickers, but GDPR. If you put data into a political region, political boundary, and you start doing things with that data, there might be regulations from that particular country that might prevent you to doing things with that data. Does that make sense? Your cloud provider is probably not going to tell you that. They're going to assume that you had spoken with your legal representation and you know what you can or cannot do with that data, okay? So be cautious when you start to look at different regions and what you do with them and what data you put there. Each region, remember, take that back. Certain regions have what are called sister regions. These sister regions allow us to also facilitate baked-in DR strategies because they are already physically isolated. They're usually across hundreds of miles, so like from East Coast to West Coast of the United States. They're platform-provided replication. There are region recovery orders, so if regions do go down for some strange reason, they will actually sequentially bring up regions in a certain order. So you can actually plan for disasters and ensure that one region comes up over another, okay? So it comes up in a certain order. And they do sequential updates. So in Microsoft, who here has ever gotten an email from Microsoft about their cloud solution? They're going to get an update. Anybody? Yeah, a couple people in the back. So Microsoft, in theory, is supposed to tell you when they're going to update stuff. It doesn't always work as cleanly as that. And they're usually going to say, we're going to update now, and there's nothing you can do about it. They've gotten better. Some services, they'll actually say, hey, we're going to update within this window. If you have something critical, let us know. But for the most part, they're going to give you a time frame, and they're going to do it right then and there. But with regions, sister regions, they do sequential updates. In the United States, these 4 regions have sister regions. So like the East US and West US are 2 sister regions. So if I'm going to do disaster recovery, and most of my consumers are in the East Coast, let's say Kentucky or Virginia or somewhere else, and I put my production stuff in the East US, if I'm going to use a certain resource in Azure, I can use the West Coast as its sister region. It's already baked into the product, okay? Any questions about regions, geographies, zones? Cool. The other terminology I want you to think about. Physics always wins, okay? When you go to the cloud, put your resources, your production resources, as close to your consumers as possible. When you think about disaster recovery, put your disaster recovery within limitations as close to your consumers as possible. If you had to fail over in a DR scenario, you have to make sure that your consumers can get to the data as quickly as possible. Yes? Right? We want to be able to be up and running, actually servicing customers because we want to sell widgets. If we sell widgets, our revenue goes up. If our revenue goes up, we make more money. If we make more money, my bonus is bigger. It's all about me, right? So we want to think about that physics always wins. So when we talk about DR strategies, we also have to take that into account. Just as we do when we put production stuff, if you start to go to the cloud, think about how you're going to put stuff in the cloud. Where is it going to sit? Okay, is it going to sit, if my consumers are on the East Coast and I'm going to put my production resources on the West Coast, that doesn't make quite sense. You're not going to beat the laws of physics. You can't beat the speed of light. I have a background in physics. If you want, I can do the math and prove it to you. Okay, so think about that when you start to think about disaster recovery in the cloud. How are you going to get to your data if you fail over? Do you have your network connectivity stood up correctly? Do you have the right gateway, the right VPN, whatever? Do you need a disaster recovery express route? Do you have a DR scenario for your cable provider, your internet provider, to facilitate getting to your DR resources? Have you thought about that? What's your single point of failure if you had to fail over in the cloud? Getting to the resources. The other thing you can do, can you afford to get physics on your side? Who here works for an organization where we have a DR strategy, but the DR strategy is half the size of production? Most organizations I work for, yes, we're going to throw everything under the sun towards production because it runs really fast, but we're going to allocate a really small chunk to DR. It's got that 28K baud modem. That's how, we know this is true. We know that there's organizations that have as small as a pipeline to DR as possible because they hope that they never have to use it, right? And so there's that 28K baud modem. We all had one, at least I had one. And so is there a way to make sure that you can increase that pipe if you had to fail over? Okay? You have to think about that pathway. HA does not equal DR. High availability, if you have high availability, usually is within the same data center. You can do high availability in the cloud, but HA is not DR, okay? You can include a DR strategy with little HA. I asked earlier, you're using availability groups. Can I stretch an availability group up into the cloud? The answer is yes. So I can take an on-premise, always-on availability group, and I probably said that wrong, and Alan Hurt's going to mock me upside the head for that. An availability group and actually stretch a third or fourth node, depending on your server version and edition, up into Azure and use that as a DR node. Availability groups are normally used for high availability, but I can stretch that into the Azure world with another node and actually use it for disaster recovery. That is an option, okay? Those are the edge cases I always consider of, yes, it's high availability, but I'm going to use that technology to facilitate DR if I had to, okay? I can do that within 2 VMs within Azure. You can do availability groups in Azure, okay? Usually a DR radius, in my opinion, should be 100 miles or more of primary data center. Who here has an organization where their DR center is like next door? True story, I worked for a client, their primary data center was 10 city blocks away. Actually, I have a client, their DR center literally is across the street. Hurricanes and tornadoes and natural event disasters don't care that your data center, your DR, is across the street. That to me is not DR. If you're thinking about using Azure, Azure is a great resource to DR things because we can put it in the cloud really far away from my primary data center, okay? Synchronous versus asynchronous. Most people with high availability, you want synchronous commits with like your availability groups because that ensures your high availability, that ensures your reads and writes are on the secondary as quickly as possible. With DR, most places will use asynchronous to push things to a DR scenario because that offloads most of the workload to the secondaries, and there's usually a higher latency between your primary data center and your DR, right? If I want to put stuff, if my consumers are in the East US, and I put my DR centers in Azure on the West Coast, I'm going to use asynchronous to make sure the latency between the East US and the West US is as low as possible. Make sense? Pretty cool. I actually have a client that I can get away with. The client that has the DR center a block away, I can use synchronous because it's so close. I can use synchronous. Neither will solve your performance issues. Whether you have HA or you start talking about DR, especially in the cloud, that is not going to necessarily solve bad coding practices. I have talked to people where they think that DR is going to magically solve your performance problems. That is not going to happen, okay? Let's talk about objectives. So this is kind of a rehash. RPO, everybody know their RPO for their organization? What's somebody's RPO? Just shout it out.
5 minutes.
Huh?
5 minutes.
5 minutes, so your RPO is 5 minutes. So you can lose 5 minutes worth of data, right? So the next one, RTO, duration, who knows their RTO? 2 hours, okay? So that's how long you can be down, okay? This is also a very important part. These objectives aren't fluid. This should not be true on your on-premises DR scenarios. When we go to the cloud, talk about Azure, this is also should hold true. When you start to look at Azure DR scenarios, you need to evaluate whether or not those technologies will meet your current RTO and RPO values. But don't think that they're fluid. Don't go, oh, if we have disaster recovery, if we're close to that RPO, RTO value, we'll be okay. Those should be hard numbers, okay? So when we start talking about DR, make sure that you understand what those numbers are. Okay, moving on to all these left alphabet soup. This is really about storage, okay? So the LRS is locally redundant storage. If you start to put stuff in the cloud as a DR, for example, I have a client where I push all their SQL backups to storage in the cloud as a DR scenario. Their DR strategy says we're going to keep 30 days of backups offsite, and I use Azure storage to do that, okay? Locally redundant storage really defines that within that data center, that data is going to be locally redundant. If that data center gets wiped out by a hurricane, it's pretty much toast, okay? Zone redundant storage, as I mentioned, the geographies and the regions and the zones, if that region has zones, I can actually put storage that is redundant within the 3 zones within that region, okay? Now keep in mind, the more redundant I am, Microsoft wants more money. So just keep that in mind, okay? I can also do geographically redundant storage. I can actually put storage or put information into storage and it gets geographically replicated to another data center across the United States or countries or wherever I want to put it. I can specify that, okay? I can also have read accessible geo-redundant storage. So by default, the native geo-redundant storage, you can't read it. So what happens if you have a disaster recovery or a DR event and you have to fail over to the secondary storage, but you can't read it? Is that useful? Not very useful in a DR scenario. You want to be able to read that secondary data source if you need it. Think web servers. If you had web servers that had to read files off of blob storage to serve the customers, and that web server got toast and you had to fail over to that secondary, if you can't read that data, that does you no good. That's a really bad DR plan, right? Here's a little bit better picture of how this works. So we have locally redundant storage. That's the smallest block. That's redundant within the local data center. Then we've got ZRS, the zone redundant storage, a little bit wider redundancy, okay? We get to scale out. Then we have GRS and RAGRS, that geographically redundant storage. That's the widest circle that we can get. Again, as you grow out that circle and out that storage, Microsoft's gonna want more money for you. Say again? The budget grows with it. Yeah, who's got a big budget? Nobody's got, oh, you got a big budget. Oh, you run your own company. I was gonna say, here's my business card, Anthony, but that's not gonna work. Yeah, as the region grows, the budget grows. Hopefully we all have big budgets. Okay, so out of the box. So this is really more, we all want the highest nines, right? I love when CIOs and CFOs come to me and say, I want 6 nines. 1, they don't know what they're talking about. And 2, the other question is, that's fine. I can make that happen. Bring me your checkbook. Bring me your big checkbook and your American Express Black Card, because I'm gonna pretty much max that sucker out, probably, if you want 6 nines, okay? By default, these are the 9s when we talk about Azure SQL DB, managed instances, and virtual machines, okay? Yes, this is more related to high availability, but in order to facilitate this level of 9s, you get some level of disaster recovery baked in, because in order to get these numbers, they have to have redundancy somewhere to get it. Make sense? So out of the box, if I went out to Azure and stood up an Azure SQL database with doing nothing else, the high availability is 99.99% or 52 minutes of downtime a year. I don't want you to think that this is a disaster recovery scenario, but I'm fairly confident with my testing, I don't need anything heavy duty because I can live with 52 minutes of downtime, okay? Microsoft does a really great job of making sure that you've got high availability baked in, but also some level, it's like availability groups of that third node. Yes, it's high availability, but I'm using it as a disaster recovery. Does that make sense? So you get some level of disaster recovery, but it's not really a disaster recovery solution, okay? So let's talk about backups and storage. What time do I get out of here?
On managed instance, for example,
Yeah.
if you use a standard tier or business critical, is there nines the same?
So the question was if you use managed instances on business tier or business critical or standard, are the nines the same? I'd have to look. I know the standard tier, they use blob storage for that. The business critical, they actually use local SSDs. I don't know that. Do you know that answer, Denny? That would make sense. With the business critical, yeah. So the answer was a standard tier managed instances actually uses, and I actually covered that later. So good question. It's like your plant. Uses blob storage as its underlying storage component. Business critical uses local SSD, and we think that the local SSD gets another high availability of 9. So you've actually got 5 nines. Yeah, 5 nines. Which, as we can see there, managed instances, 52 minutes per year, or virtual machines, 8 hours per year. So, all right, backups and storage. Sometimes in Azure, and probably any other cloud provider, I work primarily in Azure, I don't do much with the other cloud providers, you can actually take normal backups of your stuff. Nothing special. If you have a virtual machine, you got SQL Server installed on it, you can take backups. You can push it directly to blob storage, and there's nothing special about that. If that is your disaster recovery scenario, that's okay. If it fits your business needs, that's okay, all right? With that said, let's talk about some storage tiers. We've talked about the locally redundant storage and that type. There's also different tiers that you can use in your storage. You can have hot tiers. Hot tiers are data that's going to be frequently accessed. So if I'm going to have a virtual machine and I'm going to push backups to blob storage as my DR strategy, I might want that higher tier, that hot tier, if I'm going to be expected to retrieve it and restore that data somewhere else pretty regularly, okay? I mentioned my client that I actually push their backups from on-premises to the cloud, to Azure. They don't want those backups, so we don't use the hot tier because the hot tier is gonna be the most expensive, okay? You can put data in there and get it right back out with no additional charges other than your normal ingress and egress charges that you might get, okay? There's also cool tier. The cool tier says, I can put data in, but you have to leave it there for 30 days. If you take the data out before that 30 days, you get charged an extra fee because Microsoft wants you to keep it there for at least that 30 days. My client uses the cool storage. And after 30 days, we delete it out of that storage to keep the storage space small. To give you a cost comparison, I priced out 5 terabytes of cool storage and it was $85 a month. Can you guys beat that on your local on-premises storage? Probably not. Okay, so blob storage is great for offsite backups. We also have archive. This is stuff that is rarely used, but you have to keep it there for 6 months. Again, if you download it or remove it before that 6 months or the 30 days with cool storage, Microsoft's going to charge you the difference between how long that data was there and that ending period. So if I had data in archive storage and for 5 months, and at 5 months and 1 day, I deleted it or removed it, Microsoft's gonna charge me an extra 30 days of storage. Make sense? So you have to keep that in mind too when you go. Oh, I didn't click the button, that's why. Okay, any questions on storage tiers? Virtual machines. I love virtual machines in the cloud. You can take a backup of a virtual machine. Anybody a sysadmin? Do you guys take backups of your virtual machines now? How do you do it now? Veeam? Oh, I'm so sorry. We've had more issues with Veeam. Everybody using Veeam or some type of snapshot technology? VSS? A lot of people know, okay. But in the cloud, I can actually take a very simple virtual machine backup. If I stand up a virtual machine, SQL Server or web server or whatever you could use it for, you can just take a simple backup. It takes about 5 clicks in the Azure portal, and that's one of the demos I have. And you can actually schedule and configure just a virtual machine backup. Pretty simple. I don't recommend this particular method from a SQL Server perspective. I like this from a stateless. So think of web server, file server, something that doesn't have active moving transactions like a SQL database would. I've never done it on a SQL Server VM. I assume that it would work just fine. I'd much rather use this for a stateless type of technology, okay? Third-party solutions. There's a bunch out there. Anybody ever use Rto? So Rto is a third-party organization. They actually have appliances that you can put in your local data center. They also have a virtual appliance that you can put in the cloud. You can actually copy and replicate virtual machine images from one region to another. Okay, so you can actually go purchase, it's an additional cost, on top of whatever Microsoft is going to charge you for the storage, the virtual and the compute of the virtual machine. But that third-party solution will actually replicate the virtual machine from point A to point B. Or it'll actually replicate from Azure down to your local on-prem. And you can reverse that. You can actually replicate your virtual machine from on-prem up to the cloud, if you so desire, okay? So third-party solutions is another way you could do DR in the cloud, if that fits your needs. You gotta understand your organizational needs and find that right solution. Microsoft also offers a baked-in product called Azure Site Recovery, or ASR. I really like ASR. Again, I would use it for stateless type of machines. I wouldn't use it for a SQL Server per se. Basically, it will replicate your virtual machine like those third party from one region to another. This is the architectural topology of ASR and how it kind of works. But a couple of cool things that's really cool about Azure Site Recovery is you can actually test your failover. And it's relatively cheap. I actually priced out some stuff for a client for 30 servers, and it was a lot less than I thought it was going to be. I think it was like $25 per VM, which is pretty cost effective, I think. But you can, not only can you fail or test your failover, so this topology, you can actually go into the Azure portal and say, I want to test the failover. And it'll actually test the failover and give you a report back. What's also cool is if in the event you had to fail over and bring the secondary machine online, ASR will actually turn right back around and replicate back to the previous region. Okay, that's a cool technology, an easy technology, a couple mouse clicks to get it set up. But in the event of a DR, it'll just automatically replicate back to the former primary box, and then when I want to, I can fail back over, if I wanted to, okay? So ASR is a really cool solution, again, for the stateless type machines to get DR into your scenarios. Okay, so that was virtual machines. So we talked about those, a couple options for virtual machines. Managed instances. Is anybody running managed instances? You are. I think you're the first person at production? Cool. Managed instances, I think it's really cool it's getting there. Still pricey. Like the cheapest thing I've been able to find is like $750 a month in terms of like the very lowest MI that I could find, okay? We kind of already hit on this earlier to your question. There's two types that hyperscale is not available for managed instances right now, but it's coming. But we have business critical and general purpose. General purpose uses the blob storage behind the scenes. So it's actually using that, I think it's GRS or read accessible GRS behind the scenes, hot tier. And the business critical is actually using local SSDs. We kind of already talked about that. And with managed instances from a DR perspective, because it's a managed instances and I can run jobs and I can do things, I can just back up the database like normal. Anybody using Ola Holograms solution to back up stuff, right? You can do that. You can run a job on managed instances and back up the databases to blob storage. Okay, so that is that's a valid disaster recovery solution that you could do with using managed instances if you are actually using it, okay? The other cool thing about managed instances, Denny and I were actually talking about it. Who saw Pam's session yesterday about accelerated database recovery? Has anybody ever messed around with that yet? That is really cool. Who here has had a long-running transaction go completely sideways and then you have to wait and let it roll back? Oh, we've all done that. We've all been there. right? I've caused that before, okay? I know how to fix it though. That's the important part. If I screw up, I know how to fix it, okay? What was that? Yeah, unplug the server, reboot. Reboot, that's like the worst thing you can do is if you have a long-running transaction, you kill it, and everybody wants to, that's the gut knee-jerk reaction, right? I want to reboot the server, and then rollback's even longer, okay? But ADR, it's not, I didn't put it in the slide deck because I didn't even think about it until yesterday. ADR is a new disaster recovery technology that'll help you solve those long-running transactions rolling back and getting your database back online. Depending on what you do, if you have a long-running transaction and you kill it and want to roll it back and it gets stuck and you reboot, now your whole database could be completely offline until it finishes the recovery on boot up. And you have to sit there and wait. I've seen reports of somebody having to wait like 2 days based off their transaction because they had a very long-running transaction, they killed it, rebooted it. With ADR, they would be online almost instantaneously because the transaction would roll back, which is a new feature for 2019. It's already in Azure. If you're using SQL DB or thinking about going to SQL DB, that technology is already there. I had to use it in a production environment not too recently. 30-minute transaction was running. I eventually killed it because I think I missed a where clause or something, and it rolled back instantaneously. Thankfully, I put it in a transaction, but it was really cool to click rollback, highlights and run it, and it rolled back in less than a second. That is a valid disaster recovery scenario, okay? Not one we stand up, it's just baked into the product. Databases, if you're thinking about SQL DB, automatic database backup. As a DBA, I love this. If you stand up a SQL database in Azure and start to mess around with it and start putting production workloads on it, Microsoft will automatically back up your database for you and retain it for 7 days, out of the box. That's a valid disaster recovery strategy. You can just stand it up and it'll be there, okay? You can configure that to be long-term. So I want to keep that longer than 7 days. I can actually say, I can configure some storage and say, I want to keep it for 10 years, up to 10 years. You got to pay for it, right? It's not free. Nothing's free in life. You have to pay for it. But they do it automatically for you, okay? If you don't want to do the long-term, you can actually move that 7 days up to 35 days. So you can say, I want to keep the backups for at least 35 days. And after 35 days, it goes away. By default, Microsoft keeps those backups in read-accessible, geographically redundant storage. So when it takes the backups, it actually puts it into that type of storage. It gets geographically replicated to somewhere else, and you can read it. The reason they do that is that in case if the primary region goes down, I can actually do what's called a geo restore and restore the database from the secondary storage across the United States, or wherever that secondary is. Okay, does that make sense? Following me? Long-term retention, we kind of already talked about that, and we already talked about the RA GRS blob storage that it uses by default for the storage. All right, let's talk about, any questions about that before we move on? Yes, sir? The sister regions, not from the blob storage perspective. The sister region is going to come in from like when you do failover groups with SQL DB or managed instances. That's where the sister regions are going to come in. I'm sorry, hold that thought. The question was, just for the recording, is that where sister regions come in? And the answer is when the sister regions are going to come in with like failover groups and SQL database and managed instances. Sorry. Yes, sir. The RA, GRS, blah, blah, blah.
So you can get to that from any of their regions?
So you can get to that storage. If I had to restore a database, you can't do it natively. Like you can't go to SSMS and say I want to restore from there. You have to do it for SQL DB. You have to do it through the portal. You can actually go to the database within the portal. I can show you when we get in there.
It's got a URL or something.
It's actually got a drop down. It's actually got a drop down and say, I'm going to geographically restore from the secondary region. And you give it a point in time, and it actually will go fetch it from that secondary, this copy, and then bring it back and restore it for you. Yeah, but you can't write code and actually do it.
No, but you can, if your region goes down, you can just grab, go into another region.
You have to go, yeah, that's what that's for, and so that we can make sure that we can go to the portal and restore it.
So it doesn't really matter which region it's available at all.
Right, yeah, it'll be there. Yeah, yes, ma'am. Oh, good question. Good question. The question was, how often does Azure take backups of the SQL database? You can't configure it. In this case, Microsoft has that pretty locked down. It'll take a weekly backup, full backup, weekly, usually I believe on the weekends. It'll take 2 daily differentials, and it takes a transaction log backup every 5 to 7 minutes, depending on your workload. You said 5? Okay, so I thought it was 5. The documentation says 5 to 6, or 5 to 7, depending on your workload. And you can't configure that. That's baked in stone. As far as I'm aware, I'm not anywhere to actually change that. It's always in full recovery, and it's just there. Yes, sir. Does that go for managed instances? That's a little bit different because you can actually manage the instance at the server level, right? So you can actually do your own backups from there. I don't know, does it natively do backups, managed instances? Yes? Okay. Okay. Like the elastic pool? So the question was, does the elastic pool work the same way? In what sense? The elastic pool shouldn't matter with the backups. Yes, the elastic pools is more about managing and sharing compute resources. So being in elastic pool should not adjust the backup schedule, as far as I'm aware. So that's all about compute power, not disaster recovery. So it should not cause the problems. Any more questions?
Not a question, simple. One of the things that I like the most about managed instances is that you have had QA and dev on the same, cluster, same in managed instances. I give you a restore point in time from this guy to my other instance, and it was quick.
Yeah. Well, one of the beauties about you going to the cloud is that you get to take advantage of the Microsoft backbone. Last I saw, the backbone of Microsoft is like 70 terabytes a second, or something. It's some high number in terms of latency. So you get to take advantage of that. Yes, sir.
If your recovery point of traffic is less than 5 minutes, can you disable those backups and configure your route so that you have log backups every 2 minutes?
Managed instances?
No.
SQLDB, no. No. SQLDB, no. Managed instances and virtual machines, yeah, you could do that on your own. Right, but managed instances, you'd have to back up to your own blob storage. Same thing with virtual machines. That you could control, but SQLDB, you're abstracted away from the SQL instance itself. You're locked into their schedule. Yep.
The same is true on managed instances. You can take copy-only backups. You can take copy-only polls, but you can't do your own disk and
You can.
You can't even do your own copy-only.
You should be able to do your own backups to your own blob storage.
Copy-only.
Copy only. Okay. I thought you could, but okay. So the comment is that you can't do transaction log level backups on managed instances. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
This is the Azure database. It's not the SQL databases on your own VM that you manage.
Correct. Yeah, this is SQL. This is platform as a service, right? SQL VMs that you manage your own instance, then you can take backups to your own blob storage.
So if you do have disaster and you need to recover, how do you get it?
You would have to actually go into the portal and then have a secondary server and be able to, depending on the disaster, but you can go to the portal and go to the database and say restore, and then you can select whatever the sister region is or wherever the secondary region is where the backups are being stored, and restore it. And then restore it to a point in time. And I can show you that in the portal when we get there, because we'll look at that real quick. All right, any other questions? Cool. Availability groups. You can do availability groups in Azure. You can have 2 VMs in Azure and stand up an availability group. It's a little bit more complicated than on-site. It needs a little bit more information. You have to have a load balancer in Azure, because the load balancer actually holds the IP of the listener, okay? If you start messing around with Azure, they actually have a template in Azure. You can go stand this up if you've got enough money. I will tell you that I stood it up with some credits I had from Microsoft, and I didn't realize it, but some of the components, like the firewall, chewed up a lot of the credits I had messing around with it in the cloud. As we talked earlier, just as I can stretch a node from on-premises up to Azure as a third node in an availability group, I can do the same thing across regions here. So I can actually stretch a node across different regions. And so I can have a DR node across the United States. Now in that case, I would not do synchronous, I'd do asynchronous because of the latency, but I can do it. I get to take advantage of the Microsoft backbone speeds. If you can take advantage, what's faster, Microsoft or going through like your local ISP? Microsoft's going to win that battle, very, very much. You do suffer, well, you don't suffer, but you do get charged, going from one region to another, you actually get charged an interconnect. So when data leaves one region and goes to another, you get charged for that. So you do suffer a interconnect charge. So there is an additional cost there, okay? And again, synchronous versus asynchronous. Here, depending on where that secondary node is, I might do synchronous depending on latency and what my needs are, or I would most likely do asynchronous.
You have this cross region set up always on group. Do you think it's still necessary to do the ASR?
So the question is, if I were to do availability groups with VMs, and would I still use ASR? To me, that would be depend on what your business needs are. Personally, I would say no, because I'm doing disaster recovery from a SQL server level, not the OS. I'm a fan of what's faster. Can I rebuild a VM and restore a database, a SQL VM with a database, or restore it faster from an image of the VM itself? Most likely, I could stand up a virtual machine pretty darn quick in Azure. You can go to Azure Marketplace and say, I want a SQL 2019 box, and stand one up in probably, what, 6 minutes? 7 minutes, right? And then have a script ready, and as soon as that SQL server is ready, start to do restore. I would not use ASR in this case. But again, depends on your business needs. If your data security officer says, yep, we want to do both, and you got the money for it, do both. Having multiple DR strategies, on-prem or in the cloud, having multiple DR strategies isn't necessarily a bad thing. Because I'd rather have 2 DR strategies than none, right? I don't want to tell my boss that, oh, by the way, we lost the entire data center and we can't recover. Yes, sir? Are there certain regions that you can't do the stretching of replicas? Not that I'm aware of from a VM standpoint. There are limitations from like SQLDB and managed instances of what you can do with like Geographically and the failover groups with those. From a VM perspective, as long as you can stand up the VM, I'm not aware of any regions that you can't go across. I wouldn't go from like East US to Australia, but as far as I know, Denny, do you know? There are none. Answer that question. He's my boss, by the way, so. Positive reviews of my session would be greatly appreciated. All right, any other question about availability? You had a question, ma'am, sorry.
For the load balancer, is there a good template or white paper showing you how to configure the cross-region load balancer?
I'm sure there's a white paper. I know that the marketplace in Azure, you can actually go stand up a two-node availability group that comes along with domain controller as well. And we'll actually stand that up completely for you within about 30 minutes, give or take. So you have to go, it'll actually install it in the availability group will be online, the load balancer will all be there. I assume that if you Google Azure availability groups, there'll be a white paper there that will talk about the load balancer. Yeah, good, very good point, yeah. The problem with that template, and that in the firewall is what caught me. The template is going to put like the premium SSDs on there, and they can be costly. So if you start to mess around with that, go shut stuff down. Anybody hear of horror stories of people leaving things running in Azure or a cloud provider, and they get a bill for $8,000? Yeah, besides my boss back there. True story. Microsoft will be happy to leave stuff running for you, and they will be happy to send you a bill. Okay, so if you start to play around with this and do templates and whatnot, when you're done with it, shut it down, delete it, do whatever, but shut it down so you don't get a bill for it. Okay. Failover groups and geo-replication. I am a huge proponent for Microsoft Azure. I will admit it. I am biased of my cloud providers. I really like Azure. Geo-replication is a really cool thing, and so is failover groups. I can set up a DR strategy for either one of those two within about 6 clicks of the mouse. How many of you can do that when you're on-premises data center today? I can't. I can never do that. It was always 6 months of prep, 6 months of, I gotta buy the secondary RAID controller, the array, the servers, and all that type of stuff. I could never do it in 6 mouse clicks. Georeplication is asynchronous in nature to another. It's quick configuration. Again, I can set it up in like 4 or 5 mouse clicks. Failover groups, I think is one more, okay? It really uses availability group technology under the hood. So it really uses that AG technology to initialize, seed, and then replicate the data from one point to the other. So it's really an AG under the hood. You just don't see that AG, okay? Readable secondary. This is wonderful. By default, when you geo-replicate, you get a readable secondary. You can go hit it. You can actually read it. You can use it to offload reports. Who here has a production workload server that their business intelligence division says, we got to run reports from it? Oh, we all do it. Raise your hands, right? Doing this in the cloud, I can do a failover group or geo-replicate it and provide a secondary readable. Again, you're going to have to pay for it, but it's easy to do. I can force a failover. I normally don't like doing that. You can fail over with geo-replication. You run a risk of data loss, the way that it's configured, okay? And we'll talk about that with failover groups. Failover groups. Failover groups are defined at the server level. So if I have a SQL Server instance in the cloud and I've got multiple databases on it, I can define a failover group at that server level. I can put multiple databases within that file group, okay? What's really cool about failover groups, and you can see in the image, let's see if this actually works. Yay. We actually get endpoints. So with a failover group, I get endpoints. Geo-replication, I don't. What does that endpoint look like? Readable, read-write endpoints and readable endpoint. Does that look really familiar to an AG listener? Yeah, that's just like with SQL DB. If I do failover groups, it's an availability group under the hood, right? But so now the difference is that with a failover group, I get that actual read-write endpoint and readable secondary endpoint. So it makes it easier for my applications to be seamlessly transferred in a DR scenario to my secondary database site. It's pretty slick. You don't have to update connection strings or anything like that, okay? It is limited to certain regions. Yes, sir, sorry.
If you force a failover, do they reverse?
They don't reverse unless you manually do it. I think you can automate that with probably Azure CLI or PowerShell, but it won't. It's not like ASR where it will flip the replication, but it won't actually fail back. You have to manually go back in there and say, I want to failover.
That's your primary will become your secondary.
Yes.
And so when you decide to fail back later.
Yeah, so it'll switch the replication streams, and when you fail back over, everything should be in sync, assuming there's no data loss. But it won't automatically fail back over and say, oh, that secondary is now available. That's my primary. I need to fail back. It won't do that.
But for instance, we have to twice a year test our disaster recovery by doing a failover. So in this situation, we can just do a failover run for a week, fail back.
You could, yes. You could. There's a caveat to that, and I'll get to that in just give me 2 bullet points, and we'll talk about that, okay? This is limited to certain regions. So if you want to use failover groups, you need to double check that the region that you are sitting in can do failover groups. Back to your point, there's a 1-hour minimum grace period. Because these failover groups uses availability groups under the hood, by nature, it is asynchronous. Okay, so if it's asynchronous and I force a failover, what could happen? Data could be lost, okay? If we look in the portal for geo-replication or failover groups, you'll notice that there is a 1-hour minimum. That's the smallest grace period that Microsoft allows. You can go as high as 24 hours. But if I have a very highly volatile system in a failover group, so I'm sending transactions like no tomorrow through the system, and I force a failover because it's asynchronous, is it possible that transactions didn't make it to the other side? Yeah. So if I force a failover, then I run a risk of losing data on the secondary. If I have a system where I properly manage my transactions and are nice and small and I'm not highly volatile, I can maybe fail over and be okay. Depends, right? You can't change this. Yes, sir. Not that I'm aware of.
We do this during a maintenance window. So it's a planned failover.
Yep.
So you'll basically, right now, we basically shut down the client
Is that on-prem right now, your failover? Okay.
We'll shut down the client, we will, or disable the client, put in a notice that this is offline. We will, reverse our DR, get it all set up, and bring the client up on an alternate data set. But,
So with
manually do a flush of any transaction logs that haven't been shipped yet.
so my recommendation. So the comment is that they do an on-premise DR test. Before the test, they flush everything out to make sure there was no active transaction, and they do a DR, run it in DR for a week, and then flip back. Okay. In this case, what I would recommend is you shut your app off an hour before. Close off connectivity to the database, shut it down, make sure. We can probably look in the DMVs to see if there's active transactions. Do you know, Denny? So I do. Oh, okay. Oh, that's right. The one other manual failovers for the automatic failover. Yeah. So, but you can still do that. You can look in the DMVs and maybe see what the log send queue is, and then gauge that and shut the application down. Give it some time to kind of manually flush out, and then force the failover. So you can send your logs to Insight. I've never done that, but yeah, you could potentially use Azure Insights to facilitate some of that. I've actually never done that with this case. Does it? That's cool. I'd like to see that, actually. This is a failover group. Now, I will say that with managed instances, you can do failover groups. It's a little bit harder. It's not as easy as going into the portal and doing 5 or 6 clicks and whatnot, but this is the architectural topology for a managed failover. The difference is right down here for the most part. You actually have to set up 2 different VNets and pair them together, and that's a little bit more complicated. I've actually got a link in the end of the slide deck on resources. There's a really nice article from Microsoft that'll step-by-step walk you through it. It's a little bit more complicated. I'm not going to do that today because it takes about 6 hours to stand up a managed instance, and probably even quite a bit longer than I have the 75 minutes to actually do a demo of that. Here are some differences between georeplication and failover groups. So I can do automatic failovers with failover groups. I can't do it with georeplication. Okay. I can fail over multiple databases simultaneously with georeplication, but I can't with failover groups. One thing about this chart, that third line, update connection string after failover. I think that line reads a little funky, and what that really means is that with failover groups, because I have those endpoints that I can use, that read-write endpoints and are readable, I don't have to update my connection strings. If I fail over from georeplication, I do have to go update my connection strings because there is no endpoint for me to hit. Does that make sense? I think Microsoft wrote that a little funky. When I first read that, I had to stop and go back and actually read it, okay? Yes. Yeah, I read that, and I actually had Denny read it, and he said the same thing. I was like, that's written kind of funny. So make note of that. So if you use georeplication and you do a failover, you're going to have to go update your connection strings to actually hit that secondary. Whereas with failover groups, I can just fail over and it'll be magically delicious and everything will work. Just hunky-dory, right? We hope. Okay, any questions? Yes, sir. Say that again. The question is, if I fail over automatically, do I have to update the connection strings? With georeplication, you're not going to fail over automatically with georeplication. From georeplication, not that I'm aware of. It used to, and they moved away from georeplication to failover groups. With failover groups, if Microsoft initiates the failover, it'll automatically update the endpoints for you from a DNS perspective, and it's a listener with availability groups. You'll be done. Cool. Okay. Anybody else? All right. Let's do some demos. And hopefully the demo gods will be good, and my internet will work, but my mouse will not. Okay, can everybody see that? Oh, nobody can't see that. Why can't you see that? All right, can you guys see that? Okay. So in this case, and what we're going to do is we're actually going to step through, backups, ASR, and then we'll look at Georeplication and failover groups with the SQL DB. So in this case, I've got 2 web servers that I'm going to use because I said I want to use backups and ASR from a stateless machine. So I've stood up 2 basic Windows 2019 boxes, Web 1 and Web 2. And so I'm going to first start with Web 2. And Web 1 has actually been already done. I'm going to use that as an example. But if we go into the portal and click on the machine, if we just scroll down, we'll actually see backup and disaster recovery. It's pretty much that easy. We can actually go into the portal pretty quickly. Welcome to Azure Backup. It's pretty simple. It doesn't get any simpler than this, okay? You do have to create or use an existing recovery services vault in order to back up. In this case, I've already got one stood up. I just called it VM Backup Vault. If I had multiple vaults, I could select and decide where that's going to go. I can select a different policy. In this case, I'm going to just do the daily policy. In this case, I want to back up the virtual machine every day at 5 p.m. and be done with it. And I want to click Enable Backup. There you go. Yay! Right? So once it's done, I'm going to go into Web 1 just to show you what it looks like. This is what you can see that I've had some backups being taken since November 1st, okay? And we can see that it's, the last backup was successful, 11/7. Today at 9:02 a.m. It's daily policy, so you get some information. If I wanted to restore it, I could restore the VM just via clicking a button right up top.
Can you set up some kind of alert if you have a failed backup?
If you have a failed backup, yes, I believe you can. It's funny that you said that, because one did fail. Now, ASR, I'm just going to click on disaster recovery, and we're going to go into the Azure Site Recovery. We can see here that I've got this machine in East US. That blue dot is where I currently reside, and it wants me to replicate to West US. So Azure Site Recovery is going to replicate my virtual machine all the way across the United States. And I could do that pretty simply. I'm just going to click Review and Start Replication. It's going to give me a bunch of information that you can review and go through and tweak if you so desire. In this case, I'm not going to. Start Replication. Yay! There you go.
If your hard drives and everything on your VM is encrypted, does it transport the same encryption that you have?
If those hard drives are encrypted on one VM, they'll be transported to the secondary. I believe that is correct. Yeah. And if I go back to Web 1 just as an example and go into the disaster recovery, this is where I actually had one fail. So we can see here my replication health from my Web 1 server is in trouble, which is really funny because when I stood this up and got this ready for my presentation today, it was working just fine. I don't know why it died. I was hoping that I didn't even think to go back and actually look at it. But in this case, I can do the test failover if I had to, find out the events. Just up top, I can actually disable or test the failover if I wanted to. So we can see here the portal natively, out of the box, gives you a lot of options to do recovery or disaster recovery solutions for your virtual machines. Pretty simple. That took me, 3 clicks to do Azure Site Recovery? Yes, sir.
So what goes with that replication? Does that include just the block device, the VM as a whole? Because I think when the data is cool, when I go out and network infrastructure, so I have to have all that built and replicating into the VM.
So the question is, what actually gets sent? As far as I'm aware, it's just the VM itself.
What does it land into?
So it actually lands into another VNet somewhere else.
So it's not us to build
Yep.
infrastructure around that.
Not necessarily where it lands in the, not where it lands with Azure Site Recovery. If I needed to restore that somewhere, you might have to build some infrastructure around that virtual machine. Does that make sense? Yeah. Well, so it's replicating the VM itself. It's very much like using Rto or a third-party appliance that you're actually going to take a block level copy, replicate of the VM itself. It's doing the exact same thing. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Pretty simple. Yeah. Pretty easy. Okay. And next, let's just really quick. So here I've got a SQL database, SQL DB Demo 2 East. This is sitting in the East US region. We can see that there, okay? And I'm going to geo-replicate this sucker. So this is my production workload. Oh, it's already geo-replicated. This is my production workload. I thought it wasn't geo-replicated. In this case, I want to geo-replicate this to the West US. In my case, if I had my production resources on the East Coast and I was actually going to do a failover group, I'd put my failover group probably in the central US. It's another region away, but it's far enough away where that DR is away from hurricanes. It's in Tornado Alley now, but it's away from the hurricanes. It's away from the natural disasters that the East Coast might suffer, okay? We can see here that it's already replicated, the blue line, solid blue line, that means it's already replicated and it is online in the secondary site of West US. I can actually come in and replicate it to somewhere else if I wanted to. Let's see if it'll let me. I can't do it with my subscription. In this case, it depends on how big your database is, but I was able to geo-replicate this within about 4 or 5 minutes. If you're trying to do this with a 200 gig database, that's going to take a little bit longer. Because remember, it's using availability groups under the hood. It's going to initialize the secondary copy, seed it, and then bring it online. So don't think that you're going to, oh, there's a tornado. I'm in a tornado warning. I'm going to quickly geo-replicate my database. That's not going to happen. Okay? Now, what we have done is my coworker Monica works on the East Coast. What happened recently? There were some hurricanes that came along the East Coast, right? We were able to preemptively see that on the news and go to our clients and say, hey, let's geo-replicate your databases temporarily even. Let's replicate them somewhere else just in case the data centers in the East Coast have issues. That was days before. But again, tornadoes coming down your street, you're not going to have time to geo-replicate your 300 gig database. All right, failover groups. Now, because failover groups is at the server level, we have to define those on the server. So I can actually click on the server itself, server DB, server east, databasewindows.net. We can click on failover groups. I don't have a failover group stood up for this. I'm going to give the failover group a name. Let's see, it's got to be unique. I'm going to make this simple. I'm going to select the secondary server. I'm going to go, in this case, because, again, I want my DR to be as close to my consumers. My consumers are on the East Coast. But I want it far enough away that I don't have to worry about natural disasters. I want to click the central US server. I've already got it stood up. Read-write policy is going to be automatic. Grace period's an hour. I'm going to select my customer database. And we can see up here in the right-hand corner, my deployment's in progress. How many mouse clicks did that take me? 4, 5, maybe? And in about probably 4 or 5 minutes, that'll come back online. And just like the geo-replication, we can actually see that the solid line is there. I'll come back and check this in a second. That database is pretty small. There it is. We can see that it's coming online now. We can see, can you guys see the dotted lines moving? We've already stood up DNS entries for my endpoints, so my endpoints are already available. And as soon as the database comes online, I can use that read-write endpoint or the readable secondary endpoint if I had to. And we can see that eventually we'll see that it'll come online, the line will turn solid, and then we've got a failover group. And again, it went down, then automatically it would fail over, and it would be done. Pretty simple. Not that hard to do disaster recovery scenarios with your Azure resources in the cloud, okay? And look, there it is. Deployment's done. That took what, a minute? Again, small database. If you've got a 300 gig database, you're not going to do this in 2 minutes, okay? Any questions? Those were really fast demos because I've only got like 5 minutes left. Okay. That's not going to work either. Oh, it is going to work. Okay, cool. All right, before you leave, final thoughts. It's like going to the restaurant. Plan for the disaster of your choice. If you live on the East Coast and worry about hurricanes, plan for hurricanes. If you live in Tornado Alley, plan for tornadoes. If you live on the West Coast, sorry, Denny, plan for earthquakes. Or what's going on right now on the West Coast? Fires. Oh, my Lord. Anybody who lives on the West Coast, please be safe. Plan for the disaster of your choice. Test the process. Who here has a DR process that you don't test? Where's the gentleman? Oh, I think he left. But the gentleman who does a biannual DR test. That's fantastic. I know a gentleman here in the SQL community who used to work for Outback Steakhouse. His manager would routinely go through their data center, and she would randomly pull drives out of their servers to see if their DR strategy worked. How scary is that? I think I don't have any hair left to lose. It'd be gone, okay? Make sure you test whatever process you put into place. Make sure, even in the cloud, make sure your RPO and RTO values are consistent with your business needs. You could put stuff in the cloud that doesn't quite meet that. You might have to adjust. It would really suck that if you go to the cloud and you put in a DR strategy in place and it doesn't meet your business needs. If you actually had to fail over, okay? So please just confirm that. Remember, physics always wins. This is one thing I think that we had to trademark it from the DCAC side because we say it all the time. Physics always wins, okay? So when you start to talk about DR in the cloud, make sure you know how to get to your secondaries, okay? Here's some further readings. If you go to dcac.com/go/stored tiers, failover groups, Georeplication, or Azure AGs, these will actually take you to links that are white papers from Microsoft on how all this technology works under the hood. And the AG one, the Azure AG, will actually show you how to stand up the AG step by step, as well as the Georeplication or the failover group. The failover group one will also show you how to do it with managed instances, okay? Questions, answers? You just want to get out of here. Yes, sir. Are the slides available? They should be available from a PDF standpoint. I'll actually send them, because I made some tweaks, I'll actually send the PDF version to Pass. And I think Pass makes them available. Yes? No? Yeah? Okay. I wasn't quite sure, but I will send that probably within the next day or two, for sure. Session evaluations. Love session evaluations. Give me feedback. Tell me what I did good. Tell me what I did bad. I'm okay with either one. And that's it. I think I'm right on time. 2 minutes. I had 2 minutes.